Hello once again, I'm Don Jackson. Do you remember those old wanted posters that you used to see in westerns? Some outlaw with a day's growth of beard, a scar or two, and a mean look was the face that you'd see on the poster, with some kind of reward listed below the photo. Most of these outlaws were vile men, but in the movies, a few elicited much different feelings from the audience. Consider the screen portrayal of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid with Paul Newman and Robert Redford. It's a modern-day classic. So let me set up the theme for this webcast with some excerpts from a recent book, That Old Ace in the Hole by Henny Proulx, and I quote, "In late March, Bob Dollar, a young, curly-headed man of 25 with the broad face of a cat, pale, innocent eyes, fringed with sooty lashes, drove east along Texas State Highway 15 to the Panhandle. It was a roaring spring morning with green in the sky, the air spiced with sand, sagebrush, and aromatic sumac. NPR faded from the radio in a string of announcements, and he switched and listened to songs about staying home, going home, being home, and the errors of leaving home. The prolific writer of westerns, Louis L'Amour, in his novel Bendigo Shafter, published by Bantam, wrote, "People don't wear out, they give up. As far as trails go, there's always an open trail for the mind if you keep the doors open and give it a chance." I thought that appropriate to open our webcast. I was a young child in 1963. In July of that year, my parents took me to the Fantasy Island theme park in New York State. It had an Old West town where they reenacted a shootout between the so-called outlaw Brandon brothers and Marshal Rick and his deputies. The main street featured the newspaper, the Times Bonanza, a dry goods shop, a saloon, and of course the marshal's office. Now, it wasn't a real shootout. The guns shot caps that made a loud sound, and the Brandon brothers were really stuntmen who knew how to fall off buildings and stagecoaches without hurting themselves. I got my photo taken with the marshal and the actor who portrayed a colorful character by the name of Buckskin Joe. You might have seen him on television at that time. Now, if memory serves me correctly, in the souvenir shop you could buy t-shirts and wanted posters with some of the characters featured in the town. There were wanted posters by the doorways of some of the fake buildings. Most of them featured mugshots of the notorious Brandon Brothers gang. They may not have been as famous as Jesse James' gang or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but at the time, they were the closest I got to the Wild West. Bounty hunters and posses roamed the Old West in search of bail jumpers, train robbers, and other outlaws on the run from the law. The justice was harsh for those who made the choice to live a life outside the law. But sometimes those decisions were hasty ones. The internet has been likened to the Wild West, where one has to beware of modern-day snake oil salesmen and other cyber outlaws out to steal your identity and make a fast buck. One thing hasn't changed since the old American West: wanted posters with mugshots of those being pursued by the law. The FBI has its most wanted list, and today it's a little easier to spread the word about those they want to bring to justice. In the past, the only place you could see a wanted poster was outside a sheriff's or marshal's office or the jailhouse. Now all of this is available online and instantly available to police services all over the nation and around the world. It may have been easier to evade the law in the past. Today, information spreads at breakneck speed on the internet. If you were a fan of Western films, then you probably have a favorite movie star who portrayed either the man in white or the man in black. In the old movies, it was as easy as black and white to figure out who were the good guys and who were outlaws. In modern-day Westerns, like 1992's Unforgiven, it wasn't so obvious at first. Clint Eastwood portrayed an aging gunfighter who had retired from his trade after his wife died. He was coaxed back into action by a friend who heard there was a pretty hefty reward for a gang that had gone after one of the brothel girls in a neighboring town. When Clint and the character played by Morgan Freeman arrive in the town to go after the gang, they discover the law is an old nemesis played by Gene Hackman. And that's when the line between good and bad becomes somewhat blurred. Hackman's character has a sadistic streak that is evident as he tries to persuade those coming to his town to try to collect the reward to leave and be on their way. Clint eventually takes his revenge against Hackman's character in a most intense scene at the climax of the film. In this film, the audience sides with the aging gunfighter. In a sense, it's the same kind of response as in the hit TV series about a serial killer in Florida, Dexter. He may not be your first choice for a hero, but he plies his trade against those who have escaped justice, and so the audience forgives him for the crimes he has committed. The fight between good and evil is not as clear as it once was. Today, there are more shades of gray than ever before. A smile lit the eyes of the expiring Kentuck. Dying, he repeated. He's a-taken me with him. Tell the boys I got the luck with me now. And the strong man clinging to the frail babe, as a drowning man is said to cling to a straw, drifted away into the shadowy river that flows forever to the unknown sea. An excerpt from The Luck of Roaring Camp, published in 1868 and written by Bret Harte. It was not an easy life. One had to be wary of strangers and keep a close eye on money and belongings. It was a land of horse thieves, train robbers, cattle rustlers, and gunslingers for hire. The portrayal of Native Americans in movies and in books did more harm than good to those who were descendants of the great First Nations. The women in these stories and films were usually homemakers or saloon girls. In time, a few very good storylines emerged where women started to portray doctors, gunfighters, and saloon owners. Miss Kitty in Gunsmoke was a very strong character. In later films, there was a more level playing field for women in westerns, rather than just them being the romantic interest of the film's male star. One of my favorite westerns is one from the recent past. It is called White Buffalo and starred Charles Bronson as Wild Bill Hickok and Will Sampson as Chief Crazy Horse. It's been described as a surreal tale about Hickok's obsession with a giant white buffalo that haunts his dreams. In the tale, at one point, he's in a saloon. He comes close to losing his life when an outlaw played by Clint Walker and his gang stop by for a drink, but Hickok is able to shoot his way out of that one, with a little help from his gritty old friend played by Jack Warden. There's been a lot of bad luck associated with card games. Case in point, at the head of the gulch, on one of the largest pine trees, they found the deuce of clubs pinned to the bark with a Bowie knife. It bore the following written in pencil in a firm hand. Beneath this tree, lies the body of John Oakhurst, who struck a streak of bad luck on the 23rd of November, 1850, and handed in his checks on the 7th of December, 1850. An excerpt from Outcasts of Poker Flat, written by Bret Harte. Now here's bad luck of a different kind. Any idea of the real name of outlaw Billy the Kid? It was William Bonney. And what about the real name of a daring stagecoach robber who was known as Black Bart? His real name was Charles E. Bowles. For many years, the movie studios could bet on making money with a Western as long as it starred John Wayne, Henry Fonda, Gary Cooper, or Alan Ladd. The directors were legendary as well. Names like John Huston, George Stevens, Henry Hathaway, George Roy Hill, and of course, actor-turned-director Clint Eastwood. The films became classics: High Noon, True Grit, The Shootist, Shane, and in later years, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid with Newman and Redford. The so-called spaghetti westerns with director Sergio Leone, and one in particular that starred Clint Eastwood, Eli Wallach, and Lee Van Cleef. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Leone and Eastwood created a subgenre of spaghetti western with their man with no name portrayal in a few classics. Two of the most memorable might be 1973's High Plains Drifter and Pale Rider in 1985. Westerns have fallen out of favor. It was easy to note that fall when the cowboy would eventually take the fight to aliens from outer space in a recent film. Now, you can still find books by Bret Harte, A.B. Guthrie Jr., Charles Potus, and Louis L'Amour in bookstores, but there really is no one trying to revive the genre. Most publishers won't even accept a manuscript based on a Western theme. And yet, one author created the genre anew, and with one book in particular, I think she became the voice of the New West. The country appeared as empty ground, big sagebrush, rabbit brush, intricate sky, flocks of small birds, like packs of cards thrown up in the air, and a faint track drifting toward the red-walled horizon. Graves were unmarked, fallen house timbers and corrals burned up in old campers. Nothing much but weather and distance. The distance punctuated once in a while by ranch gates, and to the north, the endless murmur and sunflash of semis rolling along the interstate. An excerpt from the recent collection Close Range, Wyoming Stories by Annie Proulx, and published in 1999 by Scribner. If any writer has sparked a renewed interest in the American West, then it's Annie Proulx. But her tales are not about the old days. Her stories for this particular collection described contemporary life, but still set against a landscape that has changed very little since the days of Wyatt Earp and Jesse James. She also wrote, and I quote, "The rain quit in September, and the prairie began to yellow out. There were a few heated days. Then the weather cooled, and an early storm hoop rolled out of the northwest, slinging a hash of snow before they got the tractor dismantled to frame, motor, and transmission." End quote. She described scenarios that you might hear about in a genre of music called New Country. I've been featuring a few examples over the course of this webcast. A younger generation of authors and songwriters have rediscovered the romance that's been missing for so long. Willis Sibert Cather wrote, "In New Mexico, he always awoke a young man. He had noticed that this peculiar quality in the air of new countries vanished after they were tamed by man and made to bear harvests. That lightness, that dry, aromatic odor, one could breathe that only on the bright edges of the world, on the great grass plains or the sagebrush desert." D.H. Lawrence wrote, "The moment I saw the brilliant, proud morning shine high up over the deserts of Santa Fe, something stood still in my soul, and I started to attend. In the magnificent, fierce morning of New Mexico, one sprang awake. A new part of the soul woke up suddenly, and the old world gave way to a new." The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. The desert was the apotheosis of all deserts, huge, standing to the sky for what might have been parsecs in all directions. White, blinding, waterless, without feature save for the faint cloudy haze of the mountains which sketched themselves on the horizon, and the devil grass which brought sweet dreams, nightmares, death. An occasional tombstone sign pointed the way. For once, the drifted track that cut its way through the thick crust of alkali had been a highway, and coaches had followed it. The world had moved on since then. The world had emptied." End quote. An excerpt from The Dark Tower, The Gunslinger by Stephen King. His Dark Tower series featured a slightly different take on a few characters familiar to those who might have been fascinated by the tales of the Old West, the English knights in shining armor, and other legends too, all wrapped up into a most original work. The only difference being was the fact that the main setting for this gunslinger and the man in black happened to be on another plane of existence. We are familiar with the campfires that gunslingers and outlaws lit at night to cook their food, brew their strong coffee, and chase away the shadows beyond the firelight as they slept in their bedrolls. This excerpt about the man in black and the remains of one of those fires out in the great desert in the first volume of the Gunslinger Dark Tower series of books gave that familiar scene a whole new dimension, and I quote, "He had burned the devil grass, of course. It was the only thing out here that would burn. It burned with a greasy flat light, and it burned slow. Border dwellers had told him the devils lived even in the flames. They burned it but would not look into the light. They said the devils hypnotized, beckoned, would eventually draw the one who looked into the fires. And the next man foolish enough to look into the fire might see you." End quote. An excerpt from The Dark Tower, The Gunslinger by Stephen King, a Plume book published in 1982 by the New American Library. And just like the campfires that once kept the dark at bay, I think some essence of the Old West is still out there, even if it's only a hint of something on a gentle breeze. One of author Annie Proulx's characters in her recent collection, Close Range, Wyoming Stories, spoke of, and I quote, "packets of wild bergamot the Cheyenne had used to perfume their favorite horses." End quote. One can just imagine standing out on the Great Plains of America with the scents of wildflowers, the musky smell of horses, with just a touch of bergamot drifting on the winds. These, then, are just some of the fragrances that accompany the wind on the Great Plains, and possibly destined to last forever. Good night, sweet dreams. I'm Don Jackson.